On a Monday morning in February of 1982, Earl Haskell drove to the First Agricultural Bank of Cozad, Nebraska, and asked to speak with the branch manager. The receptionist told him Mr. Farrell was busy. Earl said he would wait. He sat in the vinyl chair beside the door for 40 minutes, hat in his lap, until Gerald Farrell came out of his office and saw him sitting there and understood that Earl Haskell was not going to leave until he was seen. "Come in," Gerald said. Earl came in, sat down, and placed a document on the desk between them. It was a foreclosure notice, the one the bank had mailed to his farm 3 weeks earlier. Earl had read it many times. He had also read something else many times in those 3 weeks, something Gerald Farrell had apparently not read recently. "I want to talk about this," Earl said, placing his hand flat on the foreclosure notice. "Mr. Haskell," Gerald said, settling into his chair with the careful authority of a man who has had this conversation many times in the last 2 years. "The bank has been more than patient. Your loan is 14 months in arrears. We have followed every required procedure. The notice is valid." Earl nodded. "The notice is valid," he agreed. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a second document on the desk beside the first. "But I want to talk about page 7 of my original loan agreement. Paragraph 4, subsection B." Gerald looked at the document, then at Earl, then back at the document. "Let me tell you about Earl Haskell. Because to understand what happened in that bank office, you need to understand the man who sat across from Gerald Farrell that February morning." Earl was 58 years old and had farmed 320 acres outside Cozad, Nebraska, his entire adult life. His father, Walt Haskell, had bought the original 160 acres in 1931. The absolute bottom of the Depression, when land was cheaper than it would ever be again, and most men were too broke or too scared to buy. Walt had been neither. He'd scraped together $800 from 3 years of hired farm work and bought land that a bank in Lexington was desperate to sell. Walt had taught Earl one thing above everything else: not how to farm. Earl had learned that the way all farm children learn it, by doing it from the time he could walk. What Walt had taught Earl was how to read a contract. "Every document you sign is a promise," Walt used to say. "Make sure you know exactly what you're promising, and make sure you know exactly what they're promising back." Earl had taken this literally. He read every contract he signed with the attention most men gave to machinery manuals, carefully, completely, with a dictionary nearby for words he didn't know. He kept copies of everything in a fireproof box under his bed, organized by date. When he'd signed his farm operating loan with First Agricultural Bank in 1971, he'd read all 11 pages. He'd asked questions about 3 clauses that weren't clear to him. He'd had a lawyer in Gothenburg look at it before he signed. And he'd noticed something on page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B, that he hadn't needed in 1971, but had thought about occasionally in the years since. Now, in February of 1982, he needed it. Let me tell you about what that clause said, because it's the heart of the story. The loan agreement Earl had signed in 1971 was a standard agricultural operating loan, the kind that First Agricultural Bank had been issuing for decades. The terms were conventional: interest rate, repayment schedule, collateral provisions, default conditions. But in 1971, the bank had been competing aggressively for farm loan business. A rival bank in Lexington had been offering better terms, and First Agricultural's loan officer at the time, a man named Dennis Pruitt, who had retired in 1978, had added several provisions to make the bank's product more attractive to borrowers. One of those provisions was on page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B. It stated, in the careful language of contracts, that in the event of default, the borrower retained the right within 90 days of receiving formal notice of foreclosure proceedings to purchase the outstanding debt obligation from the bank at a discount rate not to exceed 40% of the outstanding principal, provided that the borrower could demonstrate the ability to pay the discounted amount in full within 30 days of exercising the option. In plain language, if the bank declared foreclosure, Earl had 90 days to buy his own debt back from the bank at 60 cents off the dollar, as long as he could pay cash. Dennis Pruitt had added this clause in 1971 as a competitive sweetener, the kind of provision that sounded good to borrowers and seemed unlikely to ever be exercised. In normal times, a farmer in default didn't have the cash to buy anything. The clause was effectively decorative. These were not normal times, and Earl Haskell was not a normal farmer. Let me tell you about the fireproof box and what else was in it, because that's where the story gets interesting. When the farm crisis began building in the late 1970s, Earl had watched his neighbors with the same quiet attention his father had taught him to bring to everything. He'd watched the debt levels rise during the good years, had watched farmers borrow against rising land values to buy more equipment and more acres, had watched the confident expansion of operations that assumed the good times were permanent. Earl had not expanded. He had 320 acres, no debt beyond his operating line, and a farm that was paid for except for the annual operating loan he took in spring and paid off in fall. In good years, he paid it off in October. In difficult years, he paid it off in December. He had never carried operating debt past December 31st in 30 years of farming. Until 1980, the drought of 1980 had hit Earl's farm hard. His wheat yield was 40% of normal. His corn had barely covered the cost of planting. He'd paid his operating loan down to 60% of its balance by December and had asked the bank for an extension on the remainder, which Dennis Pruitt's successor had granted without difficulty. These things happened. Earl was a reliable borrower. In 1981, the drought continued. Earl's yields were better than 1980, but still below normal. He'd paid the 1980 remainder and most of the 1981 operating loan, but had carried a balance into 1982 for the first time. The balance wasn't ruinous. $47,000 against a farm worth, by any honest assessment, at least $280,000. But the bank's assessment of his farm's value had changed. The land values that had risen through the 1970s were falling now. The bank had reappraised Earl's collateral in late 1981 using the declining market values, and under their new assessment, his loan-to-value ratio had crossed the threshold that triggered their default protocols. On paper, Earl was over-leveraged. On paper, the bank had grounds for foreclosure. The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday in January. Earl had read it carefully. Then he'd gone to his fireproof box and pulled out his 1971 loan agreement and read page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B. Then he'd done some arithmetic. His outstanding loan balance was $47,000. 60% of that, the discounted purchase price specified in his contract, was $28,200. Earl had $31,000 in a savings account in Kearney. He'd been building it for 11 years, putting money aside in every good year against the bad years he knew would come. The way his father had taught him to save against the certainty of hard times. He had enough. Let me tell you about the 40 minutes Earl waited in the vinyl chair, because that's when the strategy was set. Earl had not gone to the bank immediately after reading the clause. He'd waited 3 weeks. He'd used those 3 weeks carefully. First, he'd driven to Gothenburg and sat with the same lawyer who had reviewed his loan agreement in 1971. The lawyer was older now, semi-retired, but sharp. He'd read the clause, read the foreclosure notice, done the same arithmetic Earl had done, and confirmed that the provision was valid, enforceable, and apparently forgotten by the current bank management. The clause is unusual, the lawyer had said. Dennis Pruitt was trying to be competitive in 71. He probably never expected anyone to use it. Can they challenge it? Earl had asked. The lawyer had considered. They could try, but it's in the original signed agreement, witnessed and notarized. They'd have a hard time arguing it out of existence. He'd looked at Earl over his reading glasses. You have the money. Earl had nodded. Then you have a very strong position, the lawyer had said. Second, Earl had done research. He'd visited the county recorder's office in Dawson County and spent 2 days reviewing property records and loan filings. He'd found something that would become important later. Documentation that First Agricultural Bank had filed foreclosure proceedings against 11 other farms in Dawson County in the past 18 months, using the same reappraisal methodology they'd used on his property. He'd made careful notes. Third, he'd said nothing to anyone. Not to his wife Margaret, not to his neighbors, not to the farmers he saw at the elevator. He'd gone about his February farm work, equipment maintenance, seed ordering, the ordinary planning of a new crop year, as though nothing unusual was happening. The 40 minutes in the vinyl chair had been the last piece. Earl had understood that arriving without an appointment and waiting without complaint sent a message before he said a word. It said he was not desperate. It said he was not afraid. It said he had time and patience and a reason for being there that was worth waiting for. Gerald Farrell had come out of his office and seen a man sitting quietly with his hat in his lap, and something in the stillness of that man had told Gerald this was not going to be a normal conversation. He was right. Let me tell you about the conversation in Gerald Farrell's office, because that's where 11 years of careful reading paid off. Gerald had looked at the page Earl indicated, page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B, and his expression had changed in a way that told Earl everything he needed to know. Gerald recognized the clause. He had not remembered it was in Earl's agreement. Now that he was looking at it, he understood exactly what it meant. Mr. Haskell, Gerald said carefully, this provision was added under the previous loan officer. It's not standard. It's in the contract I signed, Earl said, witnessed and notarized. November 14th, 1971. Gerald was quiet for a moment, reading the clause again. You're saying you want to exercise this option. I'm saying I have the right to exercise it, Earl said. Whether I do depends on what happens in this conversation. Gerald looked at him. What do you mean? Earl placed his hands flat on the desk. My loan balance is $47,000. Under this clause, I can purchase that debt for $28,200. I have that money. I can have a cashier's check here within a week." He paused. "But before I do that, I want to talk about something else." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed his third document on the desk. The notes he'd made at the county recorder's office, 11 farms, 11 foreclosure proceedings, same reappraisal methodology, same 18 months. Gerald stared at the notes. "Where did you get these?" "County recorder's office," Earl said. "Public record." He looked at Gerald steadily. "I'm not the only farmer in Dawson County with a problem that started with your bank's reappraisal." Gerald was very still. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Earl said. "I'm here to solve my problem and go home and plant my crop. But I thought you should know that I've looked at this carefully. All of it." The office was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want?" Gerald said finally. Earl had thought about this for 3 weeks, and his answer was straightforward. "I want to exercise my option and pay off my loan at the contracted discount. I want my farm's status cleared and my credit record showing paid in full. Not settled, not restructured. Paid in full. And I want the bank to review the reappraisal methodology it has been using in Dawson County, because I believe it has been applied incorrectly, and I believe other farmers in this county have been put into foreclosure who shouldn't be there." Gerald looked at him for a long time. "You're asking me to review 11 foreclosure cases." "I'm asking you to do what's right," Earl said. "I'm one man with one contract. Those 11 families are 11 problems you're going to have if someone with a lawyer looks at what I looked at in the recorder's office." He paused. "I don't have a lawyer here today. I came myself. That should tell you something about how I'd like this to go." Gerald Farrell sat back in his chair. He was 50 years old and had been in banking for 25 years. He had managed through difficult times before, but he had never sat across from a farmer who had done what Earl Haskell had done: read his contract, kept his documents, saved his money, done his research, and arrived with a position so carefully prepared that there was no good response to it except the honest one. "Give me a week," Gerald said. Earl stood, picked up his documents, and put his hat on. "You have my number," he said. He drove home and told Margaret they were going to be fine. She asked how he knew. He told her he'd explain later. Let me tell you about the week that followed, because Earl's conversation had consequences beyond his own farm. Gerald Farrell spent that week doing what Earl had suggested, reviewing the reappraisal methodology the bank had been using. What he found was uncomfortable. The bank's appraiser, under pressure to justify the aggressive foreclosure strategy that the bank's regional management had been pursuing to clean up its loan portfolio, had been applying distressed sale comparable values to operating farms, using the prices that foreclosed properties sold for at auction as the benchmark for healthy farms that weren't for sale. It was, at minimum, a methodology that wouldn't survive scrutiny. At maximum, it was a basis for 11 legal challenges that Gerald did not want to face. Gerald made calls to his regional management. The conversations were not easy. Regional management had been pushing the foreclosure strategy as a way to clean up the bank's books before the regulators got too close. Gerald's calls complicated that strategy significantly. He also pulled every loan file that had involved Dennis Pruitt in the early 1970s. He found 3 other agreements with provisions similar to Earl's, not identical, but similar enough to matter. On Friday afternoon, Gerald called Earl. "Come in Monday morning," Gerald said, 8 o'clock. Earl came in at 8 o'clock. He brought Margaret this time. She sat in the chair beside him and said nothing, but her presence told Gerald that whatever was decided in this room was going to be understood by 2 people, not 1. Gerald had a proposal. The bank would honor Earl's clause, $28,200, cashier's check, loan paid in full, credit record showing paid in full. In return, Earl would sign a confidentiality agreement regarding the specifics of the clause and its exercise. Earl had thought about this. He understood what the bank was asking. They didn't want other borrowers to know this option had existed. He also understood that he had no legal obligation to tell anyone, and that his goal had always been to save his farm, not to fight the bank. But he had a condition. "I'll sign your confidentiality agreement," Earl said, "on one condition. The bank reviews the 11 foreclosure cases I identified. Not to reverse them all, some of those farmers may genuinely be unable to continue. But review the appraisal methodology. If farms were pushed into foreclosure on the basis of incorrect valuations, the bank corrects it where correction is still possible." Gerald looked at him. "You're asking me to potentially reverse foreclosures that regional management has already approved?" "I'm asking you to do what's right," Earl said again. He paused. "I imagine your regulators would agree with me if I asked them." The room was quiet. Gerald made his decision. "Agreed," he said. "I'll conduct the reviews personally." Earl placed his cashier's check on the desk. $28,200. 11 years of savings, deployed exactly as his father had taught him. Saved against the certainty of hard times, spent precisely when hard times required it. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in a bank office. Gerald Farrell reviewed all 11 foreclosure cases over the following 2 months. In 4 of them, he found that the incorrect appraisal methodology had been the determining factor. Farms that were genuinely viable had been pushed into foreclosure because their collateral had been undervalued. In those 4 cases, Gerald negotiated restructured agreements that allowed the farmers to continue operating. He did this quietly, without announcement, with the efficiency of a man correcting a mistake he wishes he hadn't made. Earl never discussed the specifics of his agreement with anyone except Margaret and his lawyer. He kept the confidentiality agreement. But in the small community of Dawson County, some things become known without being spoken. Over the following months, the word moved through the grain elevator and the coffee shop and the implement dealer. Nothing specific, nothing that violated a signed agreement, just the knowledge that Earl Haskell had gone to the bank in February with a problem and had come home in March without one. Farmers asked him about it. Earl said only that he'd read his contract carefully and that everyone should read their contracts carefully. He said it the same way every time, without elaboration, and the repetition of the same answer eventually stopped the questions. His neighbor Tom Greer, who had been 2 months from his own foreclosure notice when Gerald's review had restructured his loan, knew what had happened. He'd never been told directly. Gerald had simply called and offered the restructuring without explanation. But Tom was not a foolish man, and the timing was not a coincidence. Tom drove to Earl's farm on a May evening. the spring fields green around them, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand. "I think you did something for me," Tom said. Earl looked at the fields. "Spring always looks like possibility," he said. "That's the good thing about farming. Every year starts over." Tom understood that Earl was not going to confirm what he suspected or claim credit for what he'd done. That was fine. Tom hadn't come for confirmation. He'd come to stand in a man's yard and let that man know that something was understood, even if it was never going to be spoken. They stood there for a while, looking at the green fields. Then Tom went home. "Let me tell you about Gerald Farrell, because he changed too." Gerald had been a banker for 25 years when Earl Haskell sat across his desk with a document from 1971. In those 25 years, he had understood his role clearly. The bank's interests were his interests. The bank's strategy was his strategy. He had implemented the aggressive foreclosure policy because regional management had directed it. And he had not looked too carefully at the methodology behind it, because looking carefully at it would have required him to do what Earl had asked him to do. After the review of the 11 cases, after the 4 restructurings, after the confidentiality agreement and the cashier's check, and the conversation with regional management that had been more difficult than any conversation he'd had in his career, Gerald had a different understanding of his role. He stayed at First Agricultural Bank for another 12 years, until he retired in 1994. In those 12 years, he reviewed every appraisal his bank conducted personally. He required that all foreclosure proceedings be brought to him before filing. He developed a reputation among Dawson County farmers as a banker who could be talked to, who would look at the actual situation rather than the paper situation, who understood that a farm's value was not just what it would sell for at a distressed auction. He never discussed Earl Haskell or the 1971 clause with anyone. But every loan agreement the bank issued after 1982 was reviewed by Gerald personally before signing, and the provisions that Dennis Pruitt had added in 1971 to win competitive business were removed from the standard template. Gerald had thought carefully about whether to keep them or remove them. He'd decided that provisions you didn't mean to honor were worse than no provisions at all. When Gerald retired in 1994, the Dawson County farm community gave him a retirement dinner at the Legion Hall. 30 farmers came. Earl Haskell was among them. He shook Gerald's hand at the end of the evening and said nothing more than what any man says at such an occasion. But he stayed until the end, and Gerald noticed. "Let me tell you about Earl's farm, because that's where the story properly ends." Earl farmed his 320 acres until 1997, when he was 73 years old, and his knees had made the decision for him that his will had resisted. He passed the farm to his son David, who had been working it alongside him for 15 years. Before he retired, Earl sat with David at the kitchen table and went through the fireproof box. Every document, every contract, every insurance policy, every deed, every loan agreement. He explained each one, what it meant, what to watch for, what questions to ask before signing anything. David had seen the box his whole life. He'd never known exactly what was in it. When Earl explained the 1971 loan agreement and page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B, David was quiet for a long moment. "That's what saved the farm," David said. "That's what gave us the option to save the farm, Earl said. "We saved it because your grandfather taught me to save money, and your great-grandfather taught him the same thing. The clause was the tool. The savings was the blade." David looked at the document. "How did you know it was there?" "Because I read it," Earl said simply. "The whole thing, before I signed." David looked at his father. "In 1971. You read it in 1971 and remembered it in 1982. Earl nodded. "I remembered it because I understood why it mattered when I read it. Not because I thought I'd need it. Just because a man should know what he's signed." David put the document back in the fireproof box. He kept the box under his bed, the same place Earl had kept it. Earl Haskell died in 2003 at the age of 79. His farm is still in the family. David farms it now with his own son, a third generation on the same 320 acres that Walt Haskell bought at the bottom of the Depression in 1931. The fireproof box is still under the bed. David's son knows what's in it. He's been shown every document, every clause, every provision. He's been told the story of page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B, and why a man named Dennis Pruitt added it in 1971 to win competitive business, and how it sat unused for 11 years until a farmer who had read his contract carefully needed it and had the savings to use it. The bank that issued the loan no longer exists. First Agricultural Bank of Cozad was absorbed into a regional chain in the 1990s, and that chain was absorbed into a larger institution after that. Gerald Farrell's careful management of that branch is a footnote in no official history. But in Dawson County, certain things are still known. That a man saved his farm by reading his contract, that he saved 4 other farms by asking for the right thing in a bank office without a lawyer or a threat, just a document and the patience to wait 40 minutes in a vinyl chair. And that somewhere in a farmhouse outside Cozad, Nebraska, there is a fireproof box under a bed, and in that box is an 11-page loan agreement from 1971. And on page 7 there is a clause that a loan officer added to win business, and a farmer read carefully and never forgot. Some men fight the bank with lawyers. Some men fight the bank with anger. Earl Haskell fought the bank with 11 years of reading and 11 years of saving and 40 minutes of sitting quietly in a vinyl chair. That's what stubborn looks like when it's done right. Patient, prepared, certain, and completely impossible to argue with.